Hey, Feminist Frequency Radio heads. You're probably sitting in traffic right now, maybe doing laundry, I don't know, enjoying this latest season of Feminist Frequency Radio, and you're thinking to yourself, this is life-changing podcasting. Where can I get more? The answer, my friends, is our Star Trek podcast, which is out now. We are tackling the new series Picard, and you really want to know what we think, don't you? Tune in wherever you find your podcast and listen today.
It's in how it happens, it's in how it looks and how it feels and the texture and the acting. It has a narrative, but it's everything Gerwig does with that narrative that is what really elevates this film and makes it, in my view, more special than just another retelling of Little Women.
Welcome to Feminist Frequency Radio. This is the show that asks you to be critical of the media you love. I'm Anita Sarkeesian, and I'm joined today by someone who definitely doesn't have the necessary talent to be a truly great painter, Carolyn Pettit.
Be great or be nothing. I'm not going to be a painter, period.
To be fair, Carolyn is a truly great writer, so, yeah.
Aw, shucks.
Aw, shucks.
Thanks, Anita.
And today we are joined by another truly great writer, Laura Hudson.
Oh, nice to be here.
This week we are talking about women who are little, but not really. But they probably were at one point, and now they're not. That's right. We're talking about Greta Gerwig's new film, Little Women. Nobody liked that joke. It's fine.
Cinema sins, number one, the women are not actually little. What the fuck movie, right? Like...
I mean, if you guys want to jump right in, I already have some thoughts on that.
No.
No.
I know, we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Cue the music. Hey, Laura.
Hi.
I'm going to awkwardly talk about you in front of you.
I like that.
Are you ready?
When people talk about me to me.
Great. Our dear friend, Laura Hudson, who is... I was thinking about your bio, and I was like, you're way more prolific than this bio gives you credit for. But anyways, Laura was an editor at Wired and The Verge, and her work has appeared in the New York Times, among like a million other places. She wrote scripts for our Feminist Frequency video series, Ordinary Women, which is really your shining accomplishment. And she's currently a writer on the upcoming HBO Max series, DMZ.
I am indeed. I also worked on the Feminist Frequency newsletter.
Oh, that's right. You did all of our cool interviews.
I did. And honestly, one of my favorite things about that job was, because I used to work in comics, I used to help coordinate the author illustrations or the creator illustrations. That was one of my favorite parts of that job. I really enjoyed that.
I don't think you've ever told me that.
Yeah, it's true.
Really liked that we did that. We used to have a budget for things like that.
Those days.
I know. That was quite the time. But now you're working in TV.
I am working in TV.
And what's so exciting about you working on DMZ is that you have such a history with comics.
I do. That's actually sort of how I broke into writing professionally. Way back in the day, what was this, 2000, 2005, 2006, I was a comic shop clerk in New York City. I was working for minimum wage as a cashier there. I was known sometimes around New York City as that girl from the comic shop. People would stop me on the street, yes. And through that, I met Heidi McDonald, who gave me my first paid writing job for Publishers Weekly. And that led to me creating Comic Foundry with Tim Leong, who's now the executive editor and creative director of Entertainment Weekly. No big deal.
Wow.
And that led to Comics Alliance and to Wired and so on and so forth. But yeah, it all started with me being a huge, huge comic book fan.
That is amazing. I didn't know all of that. I've known you for years. I didn't know that you worked at a comic book shop. I love that.
Yes, I did.
I often meet people who are like, work in video games or whatever, who started working at GameStop.
Yeah, no.
You got it.
I actually...
Did I get that right, Carol?
You did get that right.
Yeah. Mine's actually interesting because I came back from teaching abroad in Japan, and I was working at a literary agency in New York, which was, the respectable thing for me to do with my English degree. Hated it so bad. We won't talk about who it was. It doesn't matter. One point she had me washing the paper clips in the office because she thought they were dirty. No, it was like that. It was like that. And so I ended up quitting, and she was like, well, you've clearly failed at New York, so you're going to go home now, I assume.
Wow, what a monster.
Yeah, it was terrible. And as I was saying, actually, no, I'm going to stay in New York. Because I'd been thinking to myself, what do I love? What do I love to do? And I was like, I love comic books. So I took my fancy degree, and I, at the age of 26, went to work for minimum wage at a comic shop. The woman I just hired to replace me outside the office, coincidentally, had a friend who was just about to start his own comic book print magazine. That person, again, coincidentally turned out to be Tim Leong, now executive editor and creative director at Entertainment Weekly. And that's how he and I started working together. And that was basically how the rest of my career got kickstarted. So good job me for following my very stupid dreams.
Yeah, good
to be
job
a cashier
you.
at 26.
I feel like when people are like, what should you tell your younger self? You'd be like, do it exactly like I told you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hey, Carol, what's the worst job thing you've had? Do you want to talk about that? I feel like you probably had some pretty bad jobs.
Oh, I mean, the absolute worst job I had probably was a job I had one summer in college, selling newspapers door to door. Like actually having to knock on people's doors and try to hard sell them newspaper
Carolyn,
subscriptions.
If there's one thing about you is that is not a job for you.
No, I mean I hated myself for doing the job. So I think I stuck it out for 3 weeks or something, and then I just stopped showing up. I'm just I literally cannot do this anymore.
Fair.
And even working at Blockbuster Video or whatever it is that I did right immediately after that was a much more comfortable fit for me than that was.
Yeah. Well, we all have to start somewhere, don't we? And
We
look,
sure do.
now you write for the newspapers. Sort of.
Yeah, full circle.
I have
Full
once in
circle.
a while, I suppose. Sure.
All right. Well, let's talk about some Little Women who have some career aspirations.
Yeah, I mean,
Little Women with big dreams.
Yeah. Go for it.
No, I was going to say, because you were trying to make a joke with the intro about how they're not actually Little Women. I think one of the interesting things that the movie does is because of the way that this sort of turns it into a nonlinear narrative is that it actually foregrounds them not as the children that we meet in more traditional representations of the story, but as women.
Yeah.
The first time that we encounter Jo is, she is at this point a professional writer in the sense that she's being paid for her writing. Although I will say there was a tweet online that I can't get over by Jennifer E. Morrow on Twitter, because Jo is offered $10 for her short story at the beginning that said, the most depressing part of Little Women is not when Beth dies, but when Jo's short story wins a prize of $100, reminding any fellow writers reading the book that freelance rates have remained roughly stable since the Reconstruction era.
Oh, I think I saw that tweet. That is so true. Yeah. This was written and directed by Greta Gerwig, who you probably heard of from
Lady Bird.
Yeah, Lady Bird, who she was nominated for an Oscar. It was nominated for an Oscar. And so it's the latest adaptation of Louisa May Alcott's classic novel. And it's been adapted 7 times in film alone. It's been adapted in television and brought plays and all that. So Gerwig's screenplay breaks up the story's narrative structure, and her distinctive stamp as a director is all over the film. It has this rich natural lighting and the lively staging of scenes to the ways in which concerns about what it is to be a woman in the world are centered in the characters' lives. The film earned Oscar nominations for Best Picture, Best Actress, Best Supporting Actress, Best Musical Score, and Best Screenplay, but Gerwig herself did not secure a nomination for Best Director, perhaps illuminating the fact that many of the concerns the March sisters express in the film are very much still alive today, which I think is related to all of what the film is talking about and kind of what you were talking about a little bit too.
Right. I mean, I think there are absolutely seeds of so much of what this version of the story brings forward in terms of what it means to be a woman at this period in time, and in many ways that reflect what it means to be a woman now. I think one of the things that it does and does on purpose is it foregrounds them as women. Jo is a professional writer. I also think it's important that it foregrounds Amy as an adult, that we meet her as an adult, as opposed to a child, because she's Can we swear?
Yes.
She's so fucking annoying as a child. God, I'm still murderously angry about the burning of
Oh my God, isn't that
script.
horrifying?
Oh, and then-
Spoilers, but basically Amy is so, she's such a fucking monster. She's mad because she's not invited to go out on the town. She's the youngest of the daughters. It kind of makes sense that she's not invited out to this ball or play or whatever the fuck it was. And so she's so mad she burns a novel that Joe was working on. Like literally you watch her page by page burning up this.
It's very deliberate. And, then there's immediately a twist that makes it,
Of course.
Moralistic that, Joe immediately regrets it and she should never have been mad at her sister. Oh, yes, she should have.
Yeah, I was like, oh, cool. So she's gonna fall into the she's gonna fall into the ice or the water that the ice is under.
Through the ice.
Through the ice.
There you go.
And like you just saw that coming, and then you're like, oh, Joe's gonna feel bad. I'm like, but you shouldn't feel bad because you are allowed to be angry about this thing. That part really bothered me.
There are some other parts about some judgmental parts that I want to get to later that I also, they're in the original, but I think if we look closely enough or maybe make it up in our heads, we can see that maybe this film has a slightly different take on it. But one of the other thing I wanted to talk about in terms of the non-linear storytelling and what it does to foreground them as women before we sort of go back in time and see their childhood is what it does with two of the primary romances. So in the book, what happens is we see Jo and her neighbor, who is male, Laurie, growing up together. And, obviously they have, childlike friendship, chemistry. And then, ultimately at one point in time, Laurie proposes to Jo and Jo says absolutely not. And they go their separate ways onto other romances. And, I think on the part of the audience, and this was true in Louisa May Alcott's time as well, there was a deep sense of disappointment that what seemed like the fated fairy tale romance did not occur. And that, Amy, who again begins as that petulant child, ultimately ends up with Laurie. And then Jo ends up with this professor that she meets later on. This is not really a spoiler because they put it right up front.
Yeah.
Which I think is interesting. So as opposed to it being this, sort of, we didn't get the fairy tale, the failed fairy tale, and I guess this is the concession that comes afterwards, they are foregrounded as the relationships that feel fated, and I think there's something potentially interesting about, but maybe more mature, because I think the subversion that, the starry-eyed fans of Little Women now and then didn't always appreciate was that Laurie was like a high school romance, a childhood romance. It wasn't the mature match for Jo or one that made sense, and I think that what we see in the other two romances, especially when they're foregrounded not as disappointments, but as where they were always headed as adult women, is that, these were the better matches for them all along, beyond this sense of, the boy that you meet when you're 10 is the man you should marry.
Although I would argue that that isn't necessarily the case with Meg, right?
Yes. Although she is the one that makes the most intentional choice.
She does, but there is, so basically she wants to be rich and famous and all of this stuff, and she marries someone who will allow for none of that to happen in her life or give space for that. And so she is upset in her adult life. And there's a moment where she's like, I love you and want to be with you, and I'm okay not having the fancy dress. And I'm like, no, you're not.
But we also see that she's not happy with that. She did marry for love. But I think there's something subversive in that too. This idea that, if you marry for love, then, happily ever, ... that ellipsis stretches out to eternity. She does marry for love, but we actually get to see the complications that result from that even though she does care about this person, it's in conflict with so many of the things that she dreamed about and wanted for herself, and reconciling herself to a life with the man that she loves means giving those things up. And you could argue that there's an element of maturity in that. There's an element of sacrifice and maybe a note of sadness, but it is a reality of certain relationships,
Yeah.
I really like how the conversation that Jo has with the publisher at the end about the fate of, the heroine of her book, where he insists, right, that she has to be married. The heroine of the book has to be married. And Jo, kind of echoing something that Amy had said earlier. So Amy, in a conversation with Laurie earlier, tells Laurie that, she says something like, don't tell me that marriage is not an economic proposition, because it absolutely is. And, Jo says, when she sort of resigns herself to like, okay, yes, I'll let the heroine of my book get married, just as a matter of like, that's just how it has to be if I'm going to have this book published. She says, I guess even in fiction or in stories, marriage is an economic proposition. But like, first of all, Louisa May Alcott herself never actually married. But also, like, it's very clear, as with so much of so many of the conversations and the kind of meta commentary in this film, that it's not just talking about this story, but about our expectations for women in all kinds of stories, and how we sort of expect like the domestic, resolution, or the romantic, like, pairing off for women. There's a sort of obligatory nature to that a lot of times, maybe, even to this day in our narratives.
I really like at the end. I didn't know that Louisa May Alcott didn't get married, and now this makes the ending so much more precious to me. In that I loved that fake out that happened where Jo is talking to the editor, and he's like, she has to get married, and she's like, oh, I guess. And then it cuts back to her going to find the professor at the huge over the top romance scene where she like chases after the professor at the train station, is like, I love you, and you assume that they're together forever after that. I like that was like, is this real? Did this actually happen, or is this written? What part of this story is actually true? Is all of it real? Is none of it real? Like that crafting, and it wasn't throughout the whole film, but it was that particular piece of crafting at the end that I really appreciated.
How much of it is a concession to traditional patriarchal storytelling and to the entertainment industry? Always concessions. But I'll do you one better, in that Louisa May Alcott. So Little Women was originally published in 2 parts.
Yeah, and
so after the first part, this was prior to Jo getting together with the Professor Bear. She wrote to a friend after the publication of the first part and said, Jo should have remained a literary spinster. But so many enthusiastic young ladies wrote to me clamorously demanding that she should marry Laurie or somebody that I didn't dare refuse, and out of perversity went and made a funny match for her. So Louisa May Alcott was trolling.
Wow.
And she actually essentially did that in real life, although in terms of making a concession, changing the ending to be something more conventional. Although interestingly, in real life, it appears that it was less for the publisher and more for the young women who were reading her, who had subscribed to this idea that that's the only way you can have a happy ending.
Which, is it trolling if they don't realize they're being trolled?
I mean, there was at the time, and I think even to this day, people who, ship Jo and Laurie, in the same way, what is it, the people who can't get over, Rilo, is it Rilo? The Kylo?
Oh, yeah.
Rilo, just why? Yeah. But they have this, I don't actually want to defend that pairing truly. But, again, I get it that, when you're set up to expect a certain type of storytelling and story and romance is what represents a happy ending. When you don't get it, you feel a little cheated or subverted. Even though, again, I think there's an argument that this was a much more mature way of approaching that story.
And I do think that Gerwig's direction of this film imbues it with so much life, and that image of wild-haired Timothée Chalamet on the hillside, like proclaiming his love to Jo. I mean, I think it's right that they don't end up together 100%, and I think but the fact that scene to me, it feels now, even though this is a very recent film, there's already something, a kind of like iconic power to me about just the way that it looks, the way he looks, the way where it happens, all of that it makes it resonate. Like to me, there's like that kind of lingering poignancy of like, yes, we didn't end up together and it's for the best, but it was a meaningful moment in their lives in some way. And I think that only makes it more effective.
What I think is really interesting here is that I don't remember. I know I read the book as a child, but I don't really remember it. But the overarching question here is career or marriage, right? Like those are the options. You don't get to have both, right? In this universe. And I think that there are some ways in which this is still a very contemporary conversation that is unfortunate, but still a reality, even though, now the question is like, how do you have a career and marriage, and how do you have it all? And like, you can't actually do that. So I think that what I find fascinating by that is Jo, years later, is desperately lonely. Is like, I just got to make money. I got to make a name for myself. I got to do all these things. I have to, support my family. I have to do all these things. I don't have time for a relationship. I'm not open to a relationship. I can't even see it when it's under my nose, kind of thing. And so the scene where she is talking to her mother in the attic and she's like, I made the wrong decision. And her mom's like, do you love him? And she's like, I think I made the wrong decision. And her mom's like, that's not love. And she's like, I'm so lonely, and just breaks down. I thought that was incredibly powerful of like, she could have made this concession and kind of not had her career and been with this man who loves her way more than she loves him. Or he could have come back and she could have been like, well, I guess I'll be with someone because I'm because I'm lonely, as opposed to like this being the right decision for me. Right. I think that there's something really profound in that performance, in the nuance of that, because I think we can often confuse loneliness for love and affection.
Like, is love the absence of loneliness, or is it the presence of something else?
Yeah.
And yeah, I actually have the quote about that because I over-research everything. Because I think it's a powerful statement, first about feminism, and then about, again, the fact that in this world it seems to be like a zero-sum game that you have to choose between the two, or the idea that, well, I'll get to that in a second. So she's talking to her mom, Marmee. Women have minds and they have souls as well as just hearts. They've got ambition and they've got talent as well as just beauty. I am so sick of people saying that love is just all a woman is fit for. I'm so sick of it. But I am so lonely. And this idea that, of course, as a woman, she doesn't just want to be someone's love object, that she believes and knows that she's more than that. But just because she knows that and believes that and wants to be more than that doesn't mean that that's not also something that she wants. She just doesn't want to be limited to it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that in many ways, this film, because its concerns feel so contemporary in so many ways, like the experience of watching it for me was sort of like looking at a prism that reflects things, in my own life or in the lives of people I know back at me through, in a different way. I mean, those concerns about loneliness and versus love are very much things that I can relate to, and also like what creative person, when, hearing Amy talk about her painting and saying, well, I want to be great or nothing, like, doesn't have their ambitions and their insecurities kind of react to that in some way, or, and everything Amy says about the limits that women have in this world as far as their opportunities and their opportunities to make money and to support themselves, and how, they're all of that is still very much, in many ways alive today. So, I just want to, because I really think that the directing in this film is something very special. I mean, that's why I feel like it really is noteworthy, and I don't have any respect for the Oscars. I haven't in forever, but the fact that this film was nominated in some categories and yet Gerwig was not nominated for Best Director does particularly sting to me, because I just think that there's something so distinctive about this film. I think about the ways in which, very often in the March household, you have all this like overlapping dialogue, right, and action happening in this way where you kind of sense the warmth and the warm chaos of the family and their like familial, their relationships with each other, and the fun that they have together, and all of that. Like, there's there's something kind of, it reminds me in some ways of like films from the 70s stylistically, where you would have overlapping dialogue and things like that more commonly, but it's kind of fallen out of favor. But I don't know, I just feel like, when people talk about spoilers for this film, which I've seen like on Twitter, I saw somebody say, wow, it's really something how Gerwig pairs, the death of one sister and the marriage of another, because those are both times where Jo felt like she was losing a sister. And somebody reacted like, well, thanks for the spoiler. And it's like, well, this is a book that, the book's like 150 years old or whatever.
It's
there are like
151
17 other
years old,
movies
yes.
of this. Like,
Literally.
you can't, like, I don't think you can spoil Little Women, but beyond that, like, it's not, because this film, to me, the power of it is not in, like, what happens narratively, like this followed by this, followed by this, but it's in how it happens, it's in how it looks and how it feels and the texture and the acting and, like, all of these things, right? It's not like a plot. I mean, it has a narrative, but it's everything Gerwig does with that narrative that is what really elevates this film and makes it, in my view, more special than just another retelling of Little Women.
Yeah, and, Gerwig also wrote this, and I think that there's a testament to not only her directing skills, but like she conceived of the format to have, like, it's such a refreshing, unique take on how to tell a story that so many of us, and maybe it's because, like, girls are, we all read this book as little girls and blah, 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 and it's just a part of the orbit of our lives for some reason. Maybe that's also racially specific potentially, or like suburb specific. It's a white fucking movie. Like, it is the whitest of white movies. But one of the other things that I think is notable in the way that she presents all of this is that the funny moments are actually, like, I laughed out loud. Like, they're so,
You're
not
one
a lot
beauty.
of them. There's not a lot of them, but the ones that are there are so good. Like, they're so good that I'm not a very vocal laughing person in movies, and this one I like guffawed several times. So I think that balance of tension between, like, the scenes like Carolyn was talking about when Laurie tells Jo how much he loves her and tries to propose to her, with the moments of her, like, cutting her hair and for money and all that stuff. Like, I think that it's really special how it was all worked together. I'm not, like, over the moon about this movie, but I do see the value of it and the craftsmanship of how it was made, and the editing and the directing and all of that, the acting.
I think what Carolyn pointed out earlier was interesting to me, that what this is doing, and also the way that it feels, is something different than what you're used to seeing before. I was looking at the list of directors, and I remember having this discussion with several people recently, mostly men. And they were like, well, okay, obviously, Greta Gerwig did an amazing job, but who would you take off of this list? Who would you sub her in for? And, I think you look...
Todd Phillips. Todd Phillips.
I'm going to get even more controversial and say, if you look at The Irishman and what Scorsese did there, I understand maybe there's a subversion. He's trying to show, the dark side, the way that it peters out at the end if you have this sort of criminal life, as opposed to glamorizing it as he did in the past. But, I didn't see anything there that I feel like I haven't seen so many times from him. And, maybe that's a result of his success and the fact that he's done what he's done so well and so many times. But I think there's an argument that you look at what Gerwig did here, and it is something special. It is something different. I mean, what she did was transformational. This is what so many people try to do with so many great works of art. And I think we've retold Little Women enough at this point that it's basically a myth.
And also, like, why would you remake Little Women? But this is why.
Well, I mean, we're continually trying to do this. I'm not saying that Louisa May Alcott is Shakespeare, but how many times, are there, new renditions of a Shakespearean play where they're like, actually, we're setting it during World War II and we're going to make it feel fresh and contemporary. But, she does take a story that's been told a million times, that's very familiar, but also, I think, in certain ways, elemental. And I think she draws out what is elemental about it to maybe not the experience of every woman, but the experiences of a lot of women, and the ways in which those feel perfectly resonant, from the 19th century to now. And what does that say?
I wonder this may have been done, I don't know, but there's part of me that's like, what would this look like if it was set in a contemporary time? Like, what would that story look like? Little Women is, I think, pretty much always set in the time period in which it was written. It's, a timepiece kind of thing. But, yeah, I don't know, just food for thought, I guess, in terms of like, who would the characters be? What would this family look like?
I mean, it's I think there's a gentility over it, and there's also the fact that we encounter people who are much poorer than the Marches. But this is a story, contextually about a certain amount of poverty. This is a family that's struggling, whose father's away at war. I was reading a bunch of takes online before I came over here, and one of them kind of stood out to me and irritated me. Parts of it, maybe even more than Amy's, little book burning, annoyed me. And there were so the two men that Joe and Amy end up with, Laurie and the Professor Bear, whose first name I don't know, and frankly,
Friedrich.
Sure.
Friedrich. Sorry.
Sure.
Friedrich, I think. Friedrich, yeah.
They're sort of set up as, maybe if not super idealized, at least really good matches. But there are two moments in the book where they're both very judgmental of some of the sisters for reasons which, if we kind of look at them, also relate to their poverty in an interesting way. Joe, for the fact that she is publishing pulpy stories. The professor is quite judgmental about the fact that she's doing that rather than more elevated work. And the one that particularly annoys me is when Meg gets to go to that fancy party, and then the fancy girls take a liking to her, and they give her the fancy dress. And she's, it's a little fantasy that she gets to engage with for a night. I mean, this is not a dress she could afford. This is not company that she gets to hang out with all the time. And Laurie decides to burst her bubble and tell her that...
Why did he show up? I don't even understand why the fuck he was even there.
Yeah, he just, and also consider the fact that, this is the woman who always wanted the pretty things and the nice things. And, she's this is her last and only Cinderella moment before the rest of her life as a poor housewife. And Laurie steals it from her because he decides it's his business and decides to act like a jealous boyfriend / dad and totally ruin it for her.
And let's talk about Laurie for a second. Putting aside Timothée Chalamet's wonderful performance of Laurie, like I really liked that a lot. Laurie's a piece of shit. So first of all, like as soon as I started watching it, I was like, oh, all of this story is coming flooding back to me. And Laurie proposes and like ends up with Amy, even though he was in love with Joe. And then it's this whole thing and da-da-da-da-da. And I was like, what? And maybe this is time period stuff or whatever, but like it's kind of what I was talking about with it's the counter. Oh, that's what it is. Oh, thanks for letting me workshop that. It's the counter. Joe's like, I should be with him because I am lonely, not because I love him. And Amy is like, I'm going to be with him even though he doesn't actually really want to be with me and wants to be with someone else, but this is as good as it's going to get for me because I'm in love with him. And they have this whole line where Laurie's like, oh, he self-justifies it by being like, I made the right choice. Like, I'm glad that you rejected me, Joe, and this is like true love and adult and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, it's fucking not. There's nothing adult about this.
It's a great big rationalization. But I'm sure lots of people lie to themselves about their relationships.
Yeah, totally.
Like
but that's what's happening, right? Like, I think there's so much lying happening. And I think that that's the pleasure of Joe in some ways, is that like, she's not lying to herself, or she's being held accountable by her mom in some ways. Now, so then it makes you feel like, well, when she ends up with Bear, that actually is real, because everyone's like, oh my God, you love him. We hung out with you for an hour and you love him. And I'm like, oh, shut the fuck up. Whatever. But even putting aside all of that cynicism, like, I was like, oh, that's nice for her, like, because the way the story was told. Anyways, I say all that, and I think that it all makes sense for the story, right? Like, it is not a clean story. It is a complicated, messy story, and the kind of, not the morals, but the basics of it are that these people are making these choices that may or may not actually be the right moral choices for them, or what they really truly want deep down inside. And that's the fucking reality of life, is that you don't always get to do everything you want to do and be with who you want to be with and all of that,
I mean, I do think that Amy makes one of the most clear-eyed choices of anyone when she decides to be with Laurie. She knows what this is, She knows that he was in love with Meg.
She's going to regret that shit in 5 years, I'm just saying.
But, I mean, it saves her family, though. It saves her family from poverty. She
could have married the rich dude.
Yeah, but, like, everyone likes Laurie. He's, like, already a part of the family. It's easier. I mean, that's the fact of the matter. She knows who this person is. She knows how he's going to treat her. She knows how he's going to get along with her family. She knows that he's going to bring the economic resources that they need. And you take that all together as a package, it's a pretty good package for the time.
And it is exactly what she was talking about with the economic that marriage is an economic proposition. Before we wrap up, I do want to bring up it was very short back and forth between Amy and Joe about writing. And I thought that you two as writers would have some thoughts about this, because I think that it was just interesting where she talks about, it's a conversation about like, why would you write about these unimportant lives, right? Where Joe is like, our lives aren't important. Who gives a shit about like us poor kids? And Amy's like, but you will make it important through your writing.
Yeah. So there was a Vanity Fair profile of Gerwig where she talked about this moment, and I think what she says is extremely relevant to not only this conversation, but to kind of like to feminist frequencies work in general, and to like all of our concerns with representation mattering and everything. So Gerwig said when asked about that moment, she says, "I'm in agreement with Amy here, not Joe. I believe that writing about something makes it important. I think Louisa May Alcott, whether she knew it or not, made the ordinary lives of girls and women extraordinary by turning her pen to them. I still think," and this is where it really gets interesting to me, Gerwig says, "I still think we very much have a hierarchy of stories. I think the top of the hierarchy is male violence, man on woman, etc. I think if you look at the books and films and stories that we consider to be quote unquote important, that is a common theme, either explicitly or implicitly." And now we can look at the Best Picture or nominations and the Best Director nominations. You have like The Irishman, which is very much a story about violent men, Joker, which is very much a story about a violent, angry white man. And it's like, well, she's obviously correct, right? But she's also correct when she says that, by telling stories like Little Women, it elevates, it helps to level the playing field a little bit, or bring us a tiny bit closer to a more level playing field, while we still have a tremendous way to go, and we need a lot more stories. And of course, given that yes, this movie should be called like Little White Women, like we have to acknowledge, and that for everything, Greta Gerwig, even though yes, we can acknowledge that, well, it's because she's a woman that her directing wasn't acknowledged. Like we also have to acknowledge that relative to other women, she's in a position of privilege because of her whiteness, and like we need to do things to bring that imbalance less out of imbalance as well. Like anyway, it's very much one of those moments where Little Women is not just commenting on the story that it's telling, but on like our relationship to stories collectively and to women in stories collectively.
Yeah, I do think there is the power of the pen as a spotlight, but I think there are secondary questions of who gets to wield the pen like a spotlight, and who do they get to shine it on, and then the question of how do we react when we see it, because I there are small inroads that we're seeing in terms of, representation.
Like your boss.
Yeah, exactly.
What up, Ava?
Ava, she's the best. But I think there is also that secondary question of, how do we react when we see it? Do we value those stories, even when we're presented them and when we're told them? I will, if we want to end on a positive note, okay. From there's a Variety interview with Gerwig that referred, sort of what I was talking about before, about the fact that Louisa didn't necessarily get to write maybe the ending that she would have in a vacuum. She wrote to essentially please her readers. And Gerwig said about her film, "I felt if I could give Louisa an ending she actually wanted for Joe 150 years later, then maybe we've gotten somewhere."
Aww.
It's not perfect, and we haven't gotten everywhere we need to be, but the idea that maybe this is, as we're seeing these resonances between then and now, that, we have taken the steps forward. It has, there are successes to look at, even though there's a long way to go.
Well, on that note, let's take a little break.
Hey, FFR listeners. Did you know that if you join our Patreon community, you can get nifty perks like early access, exclusive weekly bonus segments, access to our friendly Discord, and more? That's right, you can get cool stuff and help us keep doing FFR at the same time. What are you waiting for? Go to patreon.com/femfreak.
What's your freak out?
Now it's time to talk about what's been thrilling us, moving us, upsetting us, or infuriating us this past week. Carolyn, you want to get us started?
Sure. Okay, so we lost an episode of a recording where of our Witcher episode, so then we had to re-record it again. I'm going to use what I think was the freak out I used the first time that we lost. So because I can't think of a new freak out. So
no one cares about the preamble.
I know, but just because you're going to be like, wait, you already freaked out about this, and I'm like, I don't think I did, but I think we lost that one. So my freak out on that episode was Watchmen, the HBO series, and speaking of stories that kind of elevate concerns that maybe haven't been elevated in the past, or that center people that often haven't been centered, or whatever, Watchmen it's not perfect, and I really have a lot of issues with it, but I have to nonetheless admire it for going for it and for being provocative in some ways that it's provocative, for trying to really, it does things that really do try to kind of foreground white supremacy as an active, structural, insidious force that just exists at every level of American life. And yes, it's doing that through an alternate universe, where superheroes exist and whatnot. But nonetheless, it's in many ways it's a deeply frustrating show. I'm not saying that I give it full marks on every level, but there were moments in that show where I really was like, wow, they really went for that, and hats off to the team who worked on that show for trying, in a really, I think, ambitious and fascinating way to tackle some things thematically and narratively that a lot of us would rather kind of ignore.
Yeah. Cool. I feel like we should maybe talk about Watchmen again, because I have now decided to try watching it again, which I had given up on. But Lara, what are you freaking out about?
I'm trying so hard to stay positive. So I'm going to talk about something I'm excited about, which is Kentucky Route Zero, which I've often referred to as...
Which was Carolyn's game of the decade, I think?
Oh, yeah. Easily.
My game of the decade,
yes.
Maybe the best game that I've ever played. The fifth act, the fifth installment of this is finally coming out after over 7 years, January 28th. Annapurna is collected it all. They're putting it out. It's coming out on Switch, coming out on PC, coming out on Mac. All of it bundled together. So if you've been waiting, you better get it. I will just read my description of it from my Slate article about it, because that's faster. It's a singularly strange and beautiful experience, a surreal, melancholy journey through the crumbling dream of a lost America. Not the mythical, rose-colored American past, popularly championed by would-be demagogues and wistful racists, but the crushing and very contemporary realities of debt and displacement that have left countless ordinary people falling through the cracks of the American dream. Its world is a stretch of Rust Belt twisted into a Mobius loop, a hollowed-out husk of a community full of foreclosed houses, abandoned mines, and lost, discarded people. But it's also an adventure sewn together with dream logic, full of impossible, non-Euclidean spaces, and magical realism that glosses even the grimmest circumstances with a sheen of absurd beauty. And the final installment, comes out obviously now. This came about in the aftermath of the 2008 recession. It's had a lot to say about the decline of America and poverty, and I think it's going to be interesting because the last installment came out prior to Trump's presidency, and I'm very curious to see how they tackle what's happened to America since then. I just got a review copy, just started playing before I came over. And I'm not allowed to say anything about it yet, but I'm very optimistic and very curious to see how they complete the series in a way that, completes the story that it's telling about America, but also says whatever it's going to say about where that's brought us today as a country.
Yeah. So real quick for anyone who may be interested, on our Twitch channel, twitch.tv/femfreak, I have started doing slow playthroughs of acts 1 through 4 in advance of act 5, just to kind of re-immerse myself in them and re-experience them myself before act 5 comes out, but also to share them with other folks. So if you want to see me, as of this recording, I've done act 1 already. You can find the highlighted videos of those playthroughs on our Twitch channel. And if you follow us on Twitch, you can be notified when I go live with Acts 2, 3, and 4, which I'll be doing in the days ahead.
Awesome. My freak out is I don't know how to talk about this yet. I'm conflicted. So it's about The Spy, which is a Netflix show starring Sacha Baron Cohen. Did you watch it, Laura?
I did. I watch everything, unfortunately. So yes, I have seen The Spy.
All right. So I will start with this. Sacha Baron Cohen is a phenomenal actor who holds, I don't know if you're agreeing or disagreeing.
I am. I did not know he was that good.
No, nobody did. And he holds space like it's phenomenal. Like, he is mesmerizing. He holds I was legit blown away. And I don't know if I'm recommending the show, but I want everyone to see his performance in it, if that makes sense, because it's magnetic. He's so magnetic. And he's playing two different characters, and the space between those, like, who fucking knew this guy could act as well as he could? Now, here's why I'm having tension around it. The story is based on a true story about a Israeli spy named Eli Cohen, who is a spy against Syria, and in Syria he assumes the identity of Amin Thabit, and he gets himself. I'm not going to spoil it. It is wild what he does as a spy and how he gets to become a spy and the things that he achieves. My problem with this film is, like, how pro-Israeli it is. In this time and day, the story is fascinating and very captivating and very interesting. I wasn't that, it took a couple episodes for me to be actually invested in it and want to know where it's going and what happens. I think it's very good filmmaking. The acting and the quality of it is quite good. But, like, it shows the Syrians in a particular way, in a very aggressive militaristic way, without quite explaining why Israel and Syria are at war. And if you don't already know that history, it's kind of like Syria's just being shitty to Israel, who's not doing anything wrong. And I have huge problems with that framing in 2019, given the relationship between Israel and the rest of the Middle East and our relationship with how we view Arabs versus how we view Israel, and all the politics around Middle East. So I have a really hard time with this show for that context, and I can't remove that context from my enjoyment of it as a really fascinating story and piece of history.
Yeah, I mean, if there were a way to locate his perspective in a vacuum, which is impossible. I mean, yes, of course, he's my understanding is he's still very much regarded as a martyr in Israel, and he had pure patriotic intentions, setting out to do this. He's, as often happens when you're a spy, things become complicated. But the larger world that this takes place in is very uncritical.
It takes place in the 60s, by the way, for context.
Right. But it's very much, it's this, it's the story of a martyr. And, I think, like a lot of patriotic stories that are told about martyrs, it's good guy, bad guy. And it's pretty much that simple. And you're right. It doesn't really get into any of those complexities at all.
Yeah. But man, Sacha Baron Cohen, whoo!
As a warning to people who may struggle with depictions of violence and harm to people, that may be, I have trouble with torture. I had some issues with that personally. So just as a warning.
I wasn't sure what you were going to talk about. It's not throughout the whole show.
There are a couple of vivid.
But yeah, there are. It's true.
It led to me Googling some things I never wanted to see personally.
Wow. Stop researching.
I can't stop myself. It's a huge problem.
All right. Well, if you want to submit your own freakout, you can do that at feministfrequency.com/freakout. That's FREQOUT. Thanks so much for listening to Feminist Frequency Radio. Stay tuned for the freaking after party, which is only available to backers of this podcast. You can learn more at patreon.com/femfreak. Would you join us for our party? Laura.
Yes. I didn't know if that was rhetorical. Yes, I will join you for your party.
Great. And if folks want to learn more about you or find out what you're up to or, all of those things, where would they do that?
You can find me on Twitter at Laura, Laura _ Hudson, Hudson.
Awesome. And you can find us everywhere great podcasts are found. But you can't find us where the shitty podcasts are found. Right? No, that's not true at all. All right. If you haven't yet, go to iTunes and subscribe, rate, and review us. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and all the social medias at FemFreak. The show is engineered by Rob Para. Carrie Stimson provides technical support, artwork by Jamie Varon, and our intro music is by Phil Circus. Join us next week for another feminist dive into pop culture. Bye.
Later.
Bye.